Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is African Americans and the election of 2016. And we have with us to talk about the election of 2016 and the impact on African American citizens, Dr. Louis Baldwin from Vanderbilt University formerly. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, you're retired now and doing great work, going all over the world, talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think we've said time and time again that you are the greatest Martin Luther King scholar in this nation, primarily because of your scholarship in reference to doing it. And that's why we simply call upon you time and time again, because not only are you familiar with Martin Luther King, but also information that is contemporary with Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to say publicly how we appreciate you and for the information that you're giving, and I know our audience feels the same way. But let's start off this African Americans and the election of 2016. Dr. Baldwin, having you make a few statements in reference to your background, education, and experiences. And then we'll have that second segment and third segment to talk about the impact of the election of 2016 on African Americans, or vice versa. That's right. You see, and so let's do it from that perspective.
Yes, well, I'm a native of Camden, Alabama. I grew up in Wilcox County, Alabama, which is known as part of the Alabama Black Belt. I grew up there in the late 40s and the 50s and early 60s, was exposed to much of what went on in terms of the civil rights movement in the Alabama Black Belt, and that instilled in me, I think, a deep interest in politics. As you well know, the civil rights movement was about not only the advancement of civil rights, but also about political rights, economic improvement in the black community, etc. So I was introduced very early to those kinds of values. Grew up in Camden, Alabama, attended the public schools in Camden, Alabama, graduated from Camden Academy High School in 1967. And in the fall of 1967, I matriculated at Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, and at that point, 1967 to 71, I not only majored in history and minored in political science, I was also involved in some of the demonstrations at Talladega College. So I graduated at Talladega in 1971 with a degree in history, went to Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, was there for 3 years in the Master of Arts program, also received the Master of Divinity degree from Colgate Rochester Crozer Seminary, and from there to Northwestern University. In 1975, I graduated from Northwestern in 1980 with a PhD in the history of religion with a particular emphasis on Christianity. So that was the beginning of my interest in American politics, and particularly the impact of American political values and systems on the African American community.
Very good. And so, Dr. Baldwin, listening to you, I can see the same trail that I took in terms of making it. And I, as a matter of fact, you graduated, you became a professor at Vanderbilt University. And I think that I was one of the first African-American students to attend Vanderbilt University after I finished my degree. And so I knew you quite well, and of course I knew all of the folks that you know from Vanderbilt University, from Kelly Miller Smith, et cetera, et cetera. And so I can say that you've made a tremendous contribution, but you also helped the university and the Divinity School make an even greater contribution in terms of the African American experience. And I simply wanted to say that so that people will know that in a real sense you've made a tremendous contribution. Now you brought with you today a book, Dr. Baldwin, and let's talk about that book.
Yes, that book, of course, is part of my effort to contribute to the continuation of the struggle through my scholarship. Dr. King always said, Martin Luther King Jr. always said, that education is a major component of the civil rights program. So I took that seriously, and in the course of my 30 to 35 years of teaching, I published a lot of books on Dr. King, and the book that you have in mind now, Behind the Public Veil, The Humanness of Dr. King, is an attempt to humanize a major figure in the civil rights movement.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we're going to get ready for our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll have about 8 minutes for the second segment, and we'll allow you to continue. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Well, you know, we've been sitting there for 35 years.
Yeah.
You
were a student of August Meyer.
August Meyer, that's right. That's right.
That's
as a matter of fact, I got to Vanderbilt because of August Meyer.
Did you?
He was over at Fisk teaching. And
he's no longer alive.
No, he and
Elliot Rutledge.
Yeah. He was over at Fisk, and they wouldn't allow him to come over to Vanderbilt and use the library. Oh, yes. And so when he left Fisk, he went to Kent State, and that's where I met, and I became one of his students. Okay. And after working a while, he said, you know where I want to send you? I want to send you back to Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah. I want you to go to Vanderbilt University. And I had a big old afro.
Isn't that something?
That's how I got
But you were there with Darlene Clark.
Darlene Clark and Bill, let's see, Darlene Clark. It's about 6 or 7 of us there.
Okay.
I was there.
She's at Northwestern, I think, now.
Is she still working? Has she retired yet?
I'm not sure, but I know she was at Northwestern. She was at Michigan State.
Then
at Northwestern.
Yeah, we were there together. We were both August Meyer students. We really had a good time in terms of studying under Dr. August Meyer, and he was a Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and he's talking about African Americans and the election of 2016. Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can continue this second segment by talking about some of the issues in this election that might have an impact upon African Americans and some of the consequences.
I think that's very important. I would say that the issues confronting Black Americans in this election, of course, are the same issues confronting all Americans to some extent. We're very interested in education, very interested in jobs, in a living wage, you know, and also issues that have to do with child care, that kind of thing. But when you look at the Black community, you're also taking into account more specific concerns, such as the relationship of the African American community to law enforcement. We know the epidemic of police shootings over the last decade. So Black Americans have a specific concerns about how we might improve relations between the Black community and policemen, of the Black community and law enforcement. And we also have a concern about equality, racial equity in the criminal justice system. And I don't see those issues being addressed very much on either side. Of course, we vote democratically, primarily African Americans do. But if you look at the presidential debates, 2 debates that have occurred so far, very little has been said about the Black community's relation to law enforcement, and very little has been said about the criminal justice system.
It seems to me that very little has been said in terms of policy about many things.
Exactly.
With this, election, but go on.
How do you deal with issues of poverty, for an example? In areas like Detroit and Chicago, how do you deal with gun violence? Essentially nothing has been said about that policy-wise. So what we're dealing with here is an African American community that is struggling with how to cast their votes. I think most in the African American community will remain loyal to the Democratic Party, but we have to admit that very little has been said about these kinds of issues, about issues of affirmative action, about issues of voter suppression and intimidation. These are the kinds of issues that black people hold dear. And unfortunately, we haven't seen much of this addressed in the debates between the presidential candidates. But I think African Americans will remain loyal to the Democratic Party.
And you know, Dr. Baldwin, sometimes it appears that we've simply forgotten what the suffrage has done for African Americans.
Exactly.
You know, and I'm just hoping that there will be a renewed attempt on the part of our leaders to further enhance what we're trying to do at the ballot box.
Exactly. If you look at the statistics now in the polls, I think we can say that 87% of African Americans will support the Democratic candidate. Of course, studies show since August of this year, 2016, that in some states 0% support the Republican candidate. And I've seen in other polls 1% to 8% for the Republican candidate. So what you see in these polls, of course, is the continuing loyalty of African Americans to a particular party system, the Democratic Party. But again, you know, the question remains, you know, to what extent have these party systems addressed the kinds of issues that African Americans hold dear?
And I think that it's true, as you indicated, that we've seen very little information in reference to what the Democratic Party can and will do in terms of policy.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, the other folks have said absolutely anything about it.
Exactly,
you know,
exactly.
And using what they refer to as dog whistles and all those kinds of old ideas of taking us back a century, almost a century.
And that's the point you have to be careful about. How, to what extent will we turn back the clock? And I think you're quite right that the failure to address these issues means, of course, that what black Americans feel and what they cherish have really gotten lost in this election cycle. You don't hear much discussed at all about what we think, or what we feel, or what we think about the future, or the kinds of issues that we hold dear, the kinds of values that we cherish. And so it's a very strange election cycle.
And I think it's summarized by the word, what have you got to lose?
Exactly, exactly.
And when you start summarizing everything and looking at a large percentage of the electorate from that perspective, it's really difficult to find out how, and I don't see how a party can survive with the kind of attitudes that many of them are taking toward not only Africans, but all minorities.
Yeah, Latino Americans, Muslim Americans, gay and lesbian Americans. You have to be very careful. I think you have to be able to respond with policy initiatives that speak to the concerns of all of these segments of our society. And unfortunately,